The year was 2387, and humanity had done something the rest of the galaxy had not been expecting. It had broken the speed of light. For thousands of years, other civilizations had watched the small blue planet from a careful distance, monitoring its radio signals, tracking its slow technological crawl, and filing periodic reports that all said roughly the same thing. The Terrans continue to develop, no action required. The Galactic Council had seen hundreds of species like this before, young civilizations stumbling toward the stars, and it had a well-practiced system for handling them. First contact protocols, a polite welcome, observer status, and a pat on the head that said, "Keep growing, little ones." The first human ship to cross the light barrier was called the Endurance, and its sudden appearance near the edge of monitored space triggered 17 automated alerts across Council sensor networks. Within minutes, a patrol fleet of 17 vessels closed in around it, none of them armed for heavy combat, because nobody in the Council thought a Class 4 developing species was worth sending warships over. Commander Yara Okonkwo was at the helm when the patrol fleet surrounded her ship. She was from Lagos, a woman with close-cropped hair and sharp brown eyes, and she carried herself with the specific kind of calm that comes not from a life without hardship, but from a life that had too much of it to let any single moment break her. She looked at the 17 alien ships on her display screen, took one slow breath, and turned to her communications officer. "Open a channel," she said. "All frequencies." Her message was short and direct. "This is Commander Yara Okonkwo of the United Earth Navy vessel Endurance, representing the unified government of Earth. We come in peace, and we are requesting formal contact with whatever authority governs this region of space." The response took 11 minutes, which felt like 11 years to the crew. When it finally came, the voice was flat and machine-translated, stripped of all warmth. "Your species is known. Terrans, Class 4 developing. An escort will be provided to Confluence Station. Do not deviate from the escort route. Class 4 developing." Okonkwo repeated those words quietly, not with anger, but with the sharp attention of someone storing information for later use. She nodded to her helmsman and said simply, "Follow their lead." Confluence Station was the seat of the Galactic Council, and it was the most extraordinary thing any human being had ever seen. It was built into the shell of a hollowed-out asteroid the size of a small moon, reshaped over thousands of years into a perfect inward spiral, and lit from within by warm golden light that bled through 10,000 windows into the dark of space. When the crew of the Endurance first saw it on the main screen, the bridge fell completely silent. One young officer whispered, "We're not in Kansas anymore," and the rest of the crew laughed, just a little, because they needed to. Ambassador Nadia Voss had been traveling aboard the Endurance as a passenger for the entire journey. She was not a soldier, she was a career diplomat, a woman who had spent her professional life learning how to walk into rooms where she was not welcome and leave with something useful. She had short dark hair, reading glasses she refused to update to modern eye correction because she simply liked them, and a posture that had never once in her life communicated uncertainty. She reviewed her materials on the shuttle ride to the docking bay. Earth's unified government, established 2301, a population of 11 billion, 3 active off-world colonies in development, 62 commissioned naval vessels, advances in medicine, engineering, and energy production that had transformed the planet in less than 2 centuries. It was a strong file, and Nadia was proud of it. She walked into the council chamber with her head up. The chamber was shaped like a great bowl, with tiered seating rising in wide rings around a central floor where representatives stood to speak. The air was cold and carried a faint metallic smell, the smell of very old power. Nadia would later describe it to her team. Representatives of all 14 council species sat in their sections, and the variety of bodies, colors, and structures. Filling those seats was enough to make a person's eyes struggle to make sense of what they were seeing. Nadia stood at the center floor and spoke for 22 minutes. She covered every point in her file with clarity and confidence, made the case for Earth as a stable and capable member of the galactic community, and answered every question she was asked without hesitation. The council listened without interruption, which was, as she would later learn, already more courtesy than most observer candidates received. Then the Vreth Collective spoke. The Vreth were the oldest species in the council, 40,000 years of spacefaring history behind them. Their internal communications, operating at frequencies human instruments could barely detect. Their machine-rendered voice carried no warmth, no malice, just the flat certainty of a species that had seen everything. The Terran species presents a record of significant internal warfare, biological fragility, short average lifespan, and a complete absence of psionic development. Emotional instability in Terrans is documented as high and considered potentially disruptive in diplomatic settings. Full membership is not recommended at this time. Observer status will be extended as a courtesy to a developing species. The vote was quick. 13 species voted to grant observer status. One species, the Theran, known for their careful and deliberate thinking, abstained without explanation. Their young analyst, a serious and quietly brilliant mind named Exarch Suvel, flagged the session in his private research notes with 2 words: "Watch them." Nadia thanked the council, picked up her datapad, and walked out with the same straight back she had walked in with. On the shuttle back to the Endurance, her assistant Torres sat beside her and asked carefully how she was feeling. Nadia looked out the window at the enormous spiral of Confluence Station, hanging in the dark, at the ships of 14 civilizations drifting past like they owned every inch of this sky, because they did, and she was quiet for a moment. Then she turned to Torres and said, "They think we're a footnote. They looked at everything we've done and everything we are, and they filed us under not important yet." She did not say it with bitterness. She said it the way a person says something when they have just made a firm and quiet decision. That is going to change. The news reached Earth within hours and landed like a dropped stone in still water. Ripples in every direction. Some citizens were furious. Some were humiliated. Political voices argued that humanity should reject observer status entirely, rather than accept what was clearly meant as a dismissal, dressed up as a welcome. But in the offices where long-range strategy was built, where military planners and naval engineers and quiet, serious thinkers did their work, the reaction was different. There were no angry speeches and no public statements. There were only whiteboards filling up with numbers, shipyard proposals being drafted, and a generation of young officers being handed training programs that were harder than anything that had come before. Earth was going to build, not just ships and weapons, but reputation, relationships, and a presence that the galaxy could not ignore. Nobody announced this plan publicly. Nobody needed to. The people making it happen already understood it completely, and the rest of the galaxy had already decided that humanity wasn't worth watching closely. That was their first mistake, and the first of many they would come to regret. 14 years passed, and the galaxy did not think much about humanity during those 14 years. The Galactic Council had other matters to handle. Trade disputes between the Krath Empire and the Merchants' Union of Cell, a slow-moving border realignment in the outer spiral, and the ongoing and exhausting work of keeping 14 very different civilizations pointed in roughly the same direction. Humanity was a footnote in those years, a name that appeared occasionally in observation reports, and almost never in serious discussions. The Isolians were not a footnote, but they were not far from one. They were a small, gentle species, insect-like in their body structure, with wide reflective eyes and 4 delicate arms, native to a cluster of 3 warm planets near the edge of the inner rim. They had been council members for 900 years. They had no military of their own, and they had never needed one, because they had always lived in quiet corners of space that nobody else wanted badly enough to fight over. That changed in 2401, when the Krath Empire decided it wanted the Yasolian star cluster. The Krath were large, armored, aggressive, and territorial, in the way that certain species become when they have spent their entire history expanding into empty space and winning every conflict they have ever started. They sent a fleet of 200 warships to the edge of Yasolian space and delivered a message that was not really a message so much as a countdown. Withdraw from your own worlds within 30 days, or we will remove you. The Yasolian government sent a formal complaint to the Galactic Council. The Council convened, discussed, formed a committee, and announced that a diplomatic resolution would likely be reached within 12 to 14 years through proper channels. 12 to 14 years. The Yasolians had 30 days. In desperation, they did the only other thing they could think of. They sent a distress signal on every available frequency, addressed to every known civilization in range, asking for help. Most responses were polite. Most said something that translated to, "We are monitoring the situation closely," or "We urge all parties to seek peaceful resolution," which meant nothing at all. Several species sent formal notes of concern to the Krath, which the Krath ignored completely. One response was different. Earth responded within 72 hours, not with a note of concern, but with a question. What do you need, and where do you need it? The Yasolian ambassador, a small and trembling official named Velsori, stared at the human response for a long time before answering, because nobody had ever asked her that before. She sent back the coordinates of her star system, the size of the Krath fleet, and the number of her people still on the ground. 3 weeks later, a United Earth Navy battle group dropped out of warp at the edge of Yasolian space. It was not a large force by galactic standards. 6 warships, 2 support vessels, and 1 command cruiser. Against the 200 ships of the Krath Empire, it looked almost comically small. Council observers, watching through long-range sensors, assumed the humans had made a navigation error, or perhaps had not fully understood the scale of what they were flying toward. The command cruiser was called the Iron Meridian, and the man standing on its bridge was Admiral Jorah Cassian. Cassian was 53 years old, built wide and solid, like a man who had spent decades refusing to let gravity win, with gray at his temples and a scar running along his left jaw from an incident during the Europa conflict that he never talked about. He had been in the Navy since he was 18 years old, and in those 35 years, he had never once commanded a mission he believed was impossible. Only missions that were hard, which was a very different thing. He looked at the Krath fleet on his tactical display for a long, quiet moment. Then he picked up the comm and broadcast on all open frequencies. "This is Admiral Jorah Cassian of the United Earth Navy. I am addressing the commanding officer of the Krath fleet currently positioned in Yasolian space. You have 6 hours to begin a full withdrawal from this system. This offer will not be repeated." The council observers listening to this transmission did not know what to make of it. 6 ships, telling 200 to leave. It was either the bravest thing anyone had ever said in this sector of the galaxy, or the most foolish. The Krath did not withdraw, so Cassian went to work. What happened over the following 11 days was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was something that the Council's military analysts would spend years trying to properly classify. Cassian did not line his ships up and train fire with the Krath fleet, because that would have lasted approximately 4 minutes before there were no human ships left. Instead, he split his forces into small, fast units, attacked from multiple directions at once, retreated before the Krath could concentrate their fire, hit supply ships at the back of the formation, disabled engines on 3 Krath destroyers using an electromagnetic pulse technique the Krath had never encountered, and generally made the experience of being in the Yasolian system feel deeply uncomfortable. Human engineers aboard the support ships modified their vessels in real time, converting mining equipment into makeshift weapons, rerouting engine power in ways that no instruction manual had ever suggested, and solving problems as they appeared with whatever materials were on hand. One ensign, named Dara Mbeki, repaired a critical navigation system using components from a broken coffee maker, and that repair kept the Iron Meridian maneuverable for 3 more days than it should have been. Meanwhile, Cassian's communications team ran a relentless psychological operation against the Krath commanders. False signals suggesting reinforcements were incoming, intercepted Krath communications played back with subtle alterations to sow confusion, and a series of increasingly confident broadcasts that gave the impression the humans knew something the Krath did not. They didn't, but the Krath didn't know that. More importantly, those 11 days bought exactly what Cassian had come to buy: time. Time for the Yasolian civilian population to evacuate from the most vulnerable settlements. Time for Council diplomatic pressure to slowly build. Time for the galaxy to watch and the Krath High Command to do a calculation they had not planned to do. The calculation was simple. This small human force had already cost the Krath 2 destroyers, a supply ship, and 11 days of operations. If reinforcements arrived, and the signals suggested they might, this engagement was going to keep getting more expensive. The Yasolian cluster was valuable, but it was not valuable enough to justify an open-ended war against a species that fought like this. The Krath fleet withdrew on the 12th day. The Yasolians sent a message to Earth that simply said thank you in every language their translation systems could access, which turned out to be 214 languages, so the message was very long. Ambassador Velsori stood in the Confluence Council chamber 3 weeks later and said something that cut through the usual diplomatic language. We called for help, and the Council told us to wait 12 years. Humanity came in 3 weeks. That difference means everything to those of my people who are still alive. The Council chamber was very quiet after that. Exarch Suvel of the Theron, watching from his seat, updated his private research note from 2 words to 6. Watch them. They fight unlike anyone else. The Council filed a formal commendation. It was the minimum possible acknowledgement of what had happened, and everyone in that chamber knew it. But something had shifted in that room, quietly and permanently, like a heavy stone that had been pushed slightly off balance and would never quite sit level again. Humanity had not just defended a small species that nobody powerful cared about. It had done something that the galaxy's military planners now had to account for. It had taken a position nobody expected it to hold, against odds nobody expected it to survive. And it had held that position through sheer refusal to be pushed back. There was a word in several of the Council's oldest languages that roughly translated as unreasonable will. It was not always a compliment, but it was never used about a species that did not matter. It was being used about humans now. 7 years after the Yasolian incident, the Galactic Council convened a full session to formally re-examine humanity's status. It had taken 7 years to organize, because the Council did not move quickly on anything, and because several of its most powerful members had very different ideas about what re-examining humanity's status should actually mean. Some wanted to upgrade Earth to associate membership, which was 1 step above observer, and still carried no real voting power. Some wanted to place Earth under a formal military oversight agreement, arguing that a species willing to deploy forces without Council authorization was a destabilizing element. Some, led by the Vreth Collective, wanted to do nothing at all and let the Terrans continue their slow, unsanctioned development under observation. The debate was loud and long, and as all Council debates tended to be, complicated by the fact that 14 different species had 14 different definitions of what words like threat, power, and stability actually meant. While this debate was happening, Humanity had been busy doing something else entirely. It had not been building new warships, though new warships had certainly been built. It had not been expanding its territory aggressively or demanding louder recognition. What it had been doing was small, quiet, and spread across dozens of star systems in ways that took the Council completely by surprise when they finally bothered to look carefully. Humans had established 9 medical outposts in underserved systems near the edges of explored space, systems that the Council considered too minor to dedicate resources to. These outposts were staffed by volunteer doctors and nurses who had signed up for 3-year postings in difficult, remote conditions. Because, as one of them put it simply in a recorded interview, somebody out there needed help and we had the training. They treated species they had never encountered before, learning alien biology on the job, adapting human medical techniques in real time, and regularly finding solutions that the patient's own species had not thought of, because sometimes an outside perspective was all a problem needed. Human engineers had traveled to 12 struggling colony worlds and offered their services freely, asking nothing in return. These were not official diplomatic missions. They were individual people and small groups who had heard about a problem and decided to go solve it. On one frozen moon in the Outer Rim, a team of 3 human engineers had restored a geothermal heating system that had failed and left a colony of 40,000 Drell workers facing lethal temperatures. They had done it in 11 days, using parts that had been declared incompatible by every technical assessment the Drell had run, because the humans had simply refused to accept that incompatible was the final answer. And then there was the cultural outreach, which no one in the Council had seen coming at all. Human artists had started showing up on alien worlds. Painters, musicians, architects, storytellers, chefs, not as official representatives, but as individuals who were simply curious about other ways of living and eager to share their own. A human composer named Aiko Tran had spent 2 years on a Theran research station learning the Theran's complex harmonic language, and had then written a piece of music that blended human and Theran traditions in a way that the Theran's own cultural scholars called the most interesting thing a non-Theran has ever done with our music. A human architect named Basil Ose had designed a public space on a Yisolian colony that incorporated both human and Yisolian aesthetic traditions, and it had become the most visited site on that world within 6 months of opening. None of this was strategic, in the conventional sense. There was no master plan directing these people to these places. There were just human beings, curious and energetic, and stubbornly convinced that every new person they met was worth knowing, going out into the galaxy and behaving exactly the way they behaved at home. The Yisolians were the first to respond to it formally. Ambassador Vel Sori stood before the Galactic Council in 2048 and invoked the kinship bond, an ancient and rarely used treaty provision that allowed one council species to formally declare a deep and mutual bond of trust and obligation with another. The last time the kinship bond had been invoked was 12,000 years ago between 2 species that no longer existed in their original forms. It was considered a ceremonial relic by most council members, but it was still legally binding, and it carried significant political weight. The Yisolian people declare a kinship bond with the people of Earth, Valsori said, and her voice was steady despite the silence that dropped over the chamber. Not because they fought for us, though they did. Not because their doctors healed our sick, though they have. We declare this bond because in our 900 years as a council member, we have never met a species that treated our lives as if they genuinely mattered to them. And humanity did that without being asked, and without expecting anything in return. 3 more species followed within 6 months: the Drell, the small marsupial-like Feni of the eastern cluster, and an isolated species called the Ori, who had not spoken formally to any council member in 200 years, but had quietly accepted human assistance during a catastrophic flood event on their homeworld, and had apparently not forgotten it. Each of these kinship bond declarations gave humanity political leverage it had not possessed before. Bonds that connected Earth to multiple council members through the oldest and most respected form of treaty in galactic law. Exarch Suvel of the Tharin was now a senior analyst, and he submitted a classified report to the Council's inner committee that shook several of its most senior members when they read it. The report was long and detailed, but its central point could be summarized simply. Humanity was not accumulating power the way every other spacefaring species in history had accumulated it. Every other species had expanded outward with a combination of military force and economic leverage, building alliances through strength and mutual interest. Humanity was doing something different. It was building loyalty, and it was building it by genuinely helping people without keeping score. A species that makes others feel genuinely cared for, Suvel wrote, does not need to threaten anyone. The beings who owe humanity are not afraid of it. They are grateful to it, and gratitude is more durable than fear. This is not a strategy we have encountered before, and it is one we do not have a standard response to. The Council voted on full membership for humanity in late 2048, and the vote was close. 8 against, 5 for, 1 abstention. Full membership was denied again. The decision was justified publicly as being about protocol and process. Humanity had still not met certain formal requirements in terms of membership duration and interstellar territorial establishment. But privately, the real reason was simpler and less flattering. The balance of power in the Council was comfortable for the species that currently held it, and adding a species that was rapidly accumulating friends and goodwill without following any of the normal rules of galactic politics was genuinely unsettling to those who had built their influence on those rules. Nadia Voss, now serving her second term as Earth's Council ambassador, received the news in her office on Confluence Station and sat with it for a moment. Then she sent a short message to Earth's government. Denied again, but the vote was 8-5 this time, and that 5 did not exist 3 years ago. She paused before sending the next line, then added it anyway. We are not losing. We are winning slowly, which is the only kind of winning that lasts. But she did not yet know how much faster the rest of the winning was going to have to happen, because something was coming that no one in the galaxy had seen yet. Something old and patient and very, very dangerous. And when it arrived, the comfortable council that had twice turned humanity away would find itself with very few places left to look for help. Nobody knew where the sorrow machines came from. That was what the council's historians would call them later, the sorrow machines, because they had no other name for them, and because that was what they did, in the end. They brought sorrow to everything they touched. They were not piloted, not directed by any living mind, not carrying any message or agenda that anyone could translate. They were weapons left behind by a war so old that the civilizations which had built them and the civilizations they had been built to destroy had both crumbled into dust thousands of years before any current council species had reached their own stars. The first one appeared in the outer edge of Vreth space in 2419. It was roughly the size of a city, roughly spherical, and covered in structures that the Vreth's best scientists could not identify despite analyzing them for 11 days straight. It moved at a speed inconsistent with any known drive technology, and it did not respond to any signal the Vreth sent it. Not because it was ignoring them, but because it was not, in any meaningful sense, listening. It was simply doing what it had been built to do thousands of years ago by people who were no longer around to call it off. What it was built to do was consume. It pulled raw material from the first Vreth station it encountered, broke it down at the molecular level, and used it to build 2 more machines identical to itself. Those 2 found more stations and became 4. Those 4 became 8. Within a month, there were 31 sorrow machines moving through Vreth space, and the Vreth, the oldest and most powerful species in the Galactic Council, a civilization that had been building warships for 40,000 years, were losing. The council convened an emergency session. The debate was immediate, urgent, and unfortunately very familiar in shape. Who had authority to act? Whose forces would lead any response? Who would bear the cost? And how any joint action could be coordinated across 14 species that had never truly fought together. Old rivalries surfaced fast. The Krath refused to serve under Vreth command. Several smaller species refused to commit forces to a conflict that had started in Vreth territory and might not spread further. The Cell Merchants Union demanded guarantees about territorial compensation before authorizing their fleet's involvement. Days passed. The sorrow machines multiplied. It was the Theran representative who finally said, in a moment of rare bluntness that silenced the chamber, "We are wasting time arguing about command structure. Every hour we argue, those machines build more of themselves. There is only one species in this council that all 14 of us have reasons to trust. And it is not because they are the most powerful. It is because they have never once used their power to advance themselves at someone else's expense. Give the command to the humans." The room went very quiet. Then one by one, the votes came in. And for the first time in 40,000 years of council history, a military command authority was placed in the hands of a species that did not hold a full membership seat. Earth's government accepted the command authority within 6 hours of receiving the request. The first call they made was to a retired admiral living in a quiet house on the coast of British Columbia, who answered his comm on the second ring, heard the situation summary in full, and said, without any hesitation at all, "I'll be at the shipyard in 3 hours. Have the Meridian prepped and ready." Admiral Jorah Cassian was 67 years old now, and he moved a little slower than he had at 53, and the gray at his temples had taken over completely. But the eyes were the same, steady and dark and completely focused. And when he walked onto the bridge of the newly refitted Iron Meridian and looked at the tactical display showing 31 sorrow machines moving through Vreth space, spreading like a fire that kept lighting new fires, he simply nodded once and said, "All right, let's build a plan." The joint fleet that assembled over the following 2 weeks was unlike anything the galaxy had seen. Ships from 11 different species, built by different engineers, running on different power systems, armed with different weapons, crewed by beings who in some cases had been on opposite sides of conflicts less than a generation ago. Coordination should have been nearly impossible. But it was less impossible than it should have been. And the reason was the humans. Human liaison officers were embedded in every fleet section, not because they ordered it, but because every other species asked for them. Because the humans had spent the last 30 years making friends all over the galaxy, learning languages, sharing food, playing music, fixing things, and generally behaving as though every being they met was worth their full attention. They had relationships built on trust, and trust turned out to be the most operationally valuable asset in a coalition military situation. Cassian ran the fleet with the same approach he had always used. He asked the people around him what they knew. He listened to their answers, and he made decisions that were built on that information rather than on what he had already assumed. He was the kind of commander who made others feel that their knowledge mattered. And in a coalition of 11 species, that quality was not just nice to have. It was the difference between a force that fought together and a force that merely existed in the same sector at the same time. The campaign lasted 43 days and was brutal in ways that the history records would later struggle to fully capture. Ships were lost, human ships and allied ships both. Crew members died, and Cassian felt every one of those deaths personally, in the way that good commanders always do, as a weight that does not leave. The central problem with the sorrow machines was their replication. Destroy one, and if you left it too long before destroying the next, there were already 2 more under construction. The only viable strategy was to destroy all active machines simultaneously, which meant coordinating the largest fleet action in recorded Council history, with precise timing across a combat zone the size of several star systems. The calculation for that timing was given to the best military mathematicians in 11 civilizations, and none of them could solve it within an acceptable margin of error. Then someone suggested asking the human physicist aboard the research support vessel Kepler's Dream, who had apparently been running her own analysis since the campaign began, and had not stopped to sleep in approximately 4 days. She was 19 years old, the youngest person on the mission roster, technically present as a junior scientific observer, and completely unconcerned with the political weight of the problem in front of her. Because she was 19, and had not yet fully understood that some problems were supposed to be impossible. She had solved it in 3 weeks. The solution was elegant and strange, and drew on a combination of human chaos mathematics and a property of the Sorrow Machine's own communication signals that no one else had thought to look at. When Cassian reviewed it with his senior tactical team, the room was silent for a long time after. Then his chief weapons officer said quietly, "This is going to work." They executed the plan on the 43rd day of the campaign. Every Allied ship moved to its designated position simultaneously. The signal went out, and the entire joint fleet fired at once across a combat space no previous commander had ever attempted to manage as a single coordinated action. The Sorrow Machines could not replicate fast enough to compensate for the scale of simultaneous loss. They fell, one after another, in a chain of destruction that moved across the star systems like a wave. And when the last one came apart in a bloom of light that Cassian watched from his bridge, with his hands clasped behind his back, the comm channels from 11 different species erupted at once, with voices in languages he could not all understand, but did not need to. The sound of relief sounds the same in every language. The galaxy was silent after that. The way it gets silent after something very large and very loud has finally stopped. Cassian stood on his bridge and let out a breath that he felt like he had been holding for 43 days. Then he turned to his crew and said 2 words, "Well done," and it was enough. Dr. Lena Park, still on the Kepler's Dream, had fallen asleep at her workstation before the final engagement, and did not wake up until 8 hours after it was over. When she was told what had happened, she looked at the results, confirmed they matched her projections, and said, "Good, I was worried about variable 7. Then she asked if there was any coffee left. Cassian laughed when he heard that, which was the first time he had laughed in 43 days, and it felt good. The silence after the Sorrow Machines fell lasted longer than the battle had. Not the literal silence of space, which was permanent and indifferent, but the silence of 14 civilizations sitting with what had just happened, and trying to find the right words for it. The Vreth Collective, ancient, proud, the oldest and most powerful voice in the Galactic Council, had nearly been erased from the galaxy. Their outer territories were heavily damaged, their population displaced, their military reduced to a fraction of what it had been. And the species that had stopped the thing responsible for all of that was a Class 4 developing civilization that the Council had twice denied a full membership seat. The math of that situation was not complicated, but it was extremely uncomfortable for the species it applied to. The Galactic Council scheduled its first unanimous emergency session in recorded history within 2 weeks of the campaign's end. Unanimous meant exactly that. All 14 species had agreed to convene, agreed on the purpose of the session, and agreed in advance to allow the results to stand without further procedural challenge. The last time all 14 members of the Council had agreed on anything that quickly, it had been to respond to a stellar disaster in the Inner Rim 6 centuries ago. This was a reckoning, and everyone in every member government knew it. The Council chamber on Confluent Station had been partially rebuilt after minor damage sustained during the crisis, and the new sections of wall and ceiling were slightly brighter than the old ones. which gave the room an odd two-tone look. A reminder, visible to anyone who walked in, that the old structure had taken some damage and the world had changed around it. Ambassador Nadia Voss was 71 years old, and she walked into that chamber slowly, but without any assistance, wearing the same deep blue diplomatic uniform she had worn at her very first council appearance 33 years ago. Altered and updated, yes, but the same fundamental garment, because she had kept it deliberately. She had told her assistant Torres, who was himself no longer young and was now her chief of staff, that she was going to wear it on the day things changed. And that day had come. Representatives of species that did not hold council seats had requested observer access and been granted it. The Asolians were present in full delegation, seated behind the human observer section, where they had always sat in quiet solidarity at every council meeting since the kinship bond. The Drell, the Feni, and the Ori were present as well, along with a dozen other species whose relationships with humanity had grown quietly over the years into something real and durable. Admiral Cassian was in the gallery too, in civilian clothes, seated beside Dr. Lena Park, who was now 20 years old and visibly uncomfortable in the formal setting, but had been told that her presence was requested and had therefore come. She had brought a notebook, because she always brought a notebook, and she took occasional small notes throughout the session, with the focused, slightly distracted energy of a person whose mind was always running two conversations at once. The session opened with a formal statement from the council's presiding officer, a Tharan elder, who read the agenda in the precise and careful way that Tharan officials always conducted formal business. The agenda had one item: consideration of full membership status for the Terran species of the Sol system. Then, Exarch Suvel stood to speak, and the chamber went very quiet, because everyone there knew that Suvel had been watching humanity longer than any other analyst in the council, and that what he said now would carry significant weight. His face carried the marks of a long career spent in careful observation and honest thinking, and when he spoke slowly and with the deliberate precision of someone who had chosen every word before entering the room. We measured the Terran species against the criteria we use for every civilization that comes before this council, he said. And by those criteria, we found them lacking. Too young, too emotional, too fragile, too short-lived, too prone to conflict, too unremarkable in the qualities we consider advanced. He paused and looked around the chamber. We were measuring the wrong things. He spoke for 14 minutes, and what he said was a careful, evidence-based account of everything humanity had done in the 33 years since first contact. Not the military engagements, though he covered those, but the medical outposts, the engineering assistance, the cultural exchanges, the kinship bonds, the thousands of small and unrecorded acts of help and curiosity and connection that had spread human relationships across the galaxy like roots spreading through soil. A species that has been in contact with the wider galaxy for 33 years should not have this many beings willing to go to war for it, he said quietly, unless those beings have very good reasons, and they do. He recommended full membership with a permanent senior seat. The vote that followed was quick and unanimous, 14 in favor, 0 against, 0 abstentions. It was the first unanimous vote on a membership application in council history. The chamber erupted in sound, not chaos, but the kind of layered, multi-species noise that happens when beings who communicate very differently all try to express the same feeling at the same time. Some species made low resonant sounds. Some made high rapid clicks. Several of the human observers in the gallery were simply crying, quietly, without any embarrassment. Nadia Voss stood at the center floor and waited for the room to settle, and when it did, the presiding officer turned to her and said something that had never been said before in that chamber to a representative of Earth. Ambassador Voss, The Council invites you to cast your world's first official vote as a full member. The vote was a procedural one, a confirmation of the session's own minutes, essentially meaningless in practical terms. But everyone understood that it was not about the content of the vote. It was about the act. Nadia stood at the center of that enormous room, surrounded by the representatives of 14 civilizations and the watching faces of dozens more. And for a moment, she was quiet. She was thinking, Torres would later say, about the first time she had stood in this exact spot, 33 years ago, young and confident, and completely certain that she was going to walk out with a full membership, and utterly unprepared for the slow, grinding, humbling decades of work that had followed. She was also thinking about everyone who had done that work alongside her, and before her, the engineers and doctors and soldiers and artists and scientists and ordinary people who had gone out into an unfamiliar galaxy and behaved like themselves, fully and without apology, and had somehow made the entire galaxy a little more familiar in the process. She was thinking about Yara Okonkwo, who had flown the Endurance into monitored space with steady hands. She was thinking about Jorah Cassian, who was sitting in the gallery right now, in a plain gray jacket, looking like he was trying not to be noticed. She was thinking about Lena Park, who was probably writing something in her notebook at this very moment. Nadia smiled, not the careful diplomatic smile she had been wearing in this room for 3 decades, but a real one, the kind that starts in the eyes. "We vote yes," she said. Then she added, clearly and without any ceremony at all, "We have been ready for a while." The gallery laughed, not unkindly, but with recognition, the way you laugh when someone says something true that everyone already knew. The session closed shortly after, and the corridor outside the chamber filled with voices and movement and the particular energy of a moment that everyone present understood would be retold for a long time. Cassian found Nadia in the crowd, and they stood together for a moment without saying anything, the way old allies do when words feel smaller than the occasion. Far down the corridor, near the wide observation windows that looked out at the stars, 2 small figures were sitting on a bench together. One was a human child, the daughter of one of the embassy's staff, who had been brought along to the session as a rare treat. The other was a Vreth child, young enough that the advanced light communication of adult Vreth was still beyond it, present with its parents' diplomatic delegation. Neither child spoke a shared language, but the human girl had brought a container of food from the embassy kitchen, small sweet rolls her mother had baked that morning, and she had held one out to the Vreth child with a simple, open gesture that meant the same thing in every language that had ever existed. The Vreth child took it. They sat there together eating, looking out at the stars, occasionally making small sounds at each other that neither of them could translate, but both of them found funny. Around them, the galaxy's oldest political body was being rebuilt into something new. Something that had room in it for a species that was too young, too emotional, too fragile, and too stubbornly, impossibly, relentlessly convinced that every person they met was worth knowing. The Council had spent 33 years looking at humanity and asking what they could do. They had never asked the right question, which was not what humanity could do, but what humanity would do, given a chance and little trust. The 2 children on the bench already knew the answer, even if they could not say it in words. They were sharing food and laughing at something neither of them understood, and that was enough. It had always been enough.